In the last video, we put together this outline of an initial test for purchasing concert tickets, and in this video, we're going to work towards implementing this feature. So to get started, let's run this test and clean up any silly errors we have. The first one is that we're missing a factory for the concert, so we know we can solve that by just importing the concert class. If we run the test again, the next error that we see is that we have no concerts table. So we know we can solve this one by using our database migrations trait. So if we pull in the database migrations trait and run our test again, we should get a different error. And now we're seeing our tests fail because of an undefined variable, payment gateway in this case. And that's from down here where we're trying to use our payment gateway to get a valid token for testing or to figure out the total of the charges that were made to that payment gateway during this test. So at this point, we need to make a decision about what that variable is actually going to be. One approach that we could take would be to drive out a real payment gateway that actually talks to Stripe, maybe something like this, Stripe Gateway. And this maybe takes some keys or secrets in its constructor or something like that. And then we could use that to actually talk to Stripe and verify that everything's working. Now the downfall of this approach is that would make this test dependent on being able to talk to Stripe. That means we wouldn't be able to run this test unless we were connected to the internet because it would be trying to contact Stripe servers. Instead, what I like to do in situations like this is create a fake, maybe something like a fake payment gateway that just works completely in memory and completely locally, but as far as the rest of the system is concerned, behaves exactly like the Stripe gateway. So nothing else in the application would have to change, we could just swap it in. Then what I would do is I would drive out the actual Stripe gateway with its own integration tests that do talk to Stripe, and that's something that we're going to cover in the next course module. But for now, let's just work with this, and we'll run our tests again and just see what happens. So now, of course, we're getting an error that there is no fake payment gateway. So let's add this class. So let's go over to our app folder. I'm going to create a new folder here called billing. And inside this billing folder, we'll create a new file called fake payment gateway. And we'll put this class in the app billing namespace. And we'll create this class now. So class fake payment gateway. And we'll just leave it empty and we'll just run our tests again. We're still getting the same error, but now we can import this class from the namespace that it's in and hopefully get a new error. So we've imported the class, run the tests again, and now we get an error that the getValidTestToken method is undefined on the payment gateway. So let's jump back into that class and add that method, getValidTestToken. And we can just have this return basically whatever string we want because we're going to keep this sort of encapsulated in this class. So no one else really needs to know what the token actually is. So why don't we just return something like valid token as a string for now and head back to our tests and run it one more time. And now we're getting an error that there's an undefined method total charges, which of course makes sense. So to figure out exactly how I want this to work, I'm going to take this opportunity to do some API design with our payment gateway and drive out some behavior with unit tests. So if we head over to our unit folder, I'm going to make a new folder in here called billing because I like my test folders to match the folder structure of my application. And then inside of this, I'm going to create a test called fake payment gateway test. And we can scaffold out a new test case here and we'll call it again fake payment gateway test. And now we have a place to think about exactly how we want this payment gateway to work. So again, instead of just testing specific methods on this class, I want to use this as an opportunity to create some specifications for the behavior of this class. And in the test of those behaviors, we're going to make use of the API of this class and therefore get implicit coverage for those methods. So I might start off with a test that's something like test charges with a valid payment token are successful. So now we can think about what the steps of this might be. Our first step might just be to create a payment gateway. So we can say that our payment gateway is equal to new fake payment gateway. Our next step might be that we want to charge something against this payment gateway. So maybe we do something like payment gateway charge, and we'll charge some amount. So maybe we'll charge $25. And now we have to pass in the token to use for the charge. So since we want a valid payment token, we can ask for that from the payment gateway. So we can say payment gateway get valid test token. And now our assertion can just be that we get $25 back when we ask for the total charges of the payment gateway. So we can say this assert equals 2,500 payment gateway total charges. And now let's run this test and drive out this implementation. So first we get an error about the class not existing, so we can import that, run our tests again. Now we get an error about an undefined charge method. So let's go back to our class and add this charge method. So we'll add a public function called charge. Run the tests again. Now we get an error about an undefined total charges method. So we'll add total charges and run the tests again. And now we're getting a logical error that null does not match 2500. So we can use this as an opportunity to actually drive out the implementation. So what would this look like? Maybe total charges should return this charges, and then maybe sum. Just take advantage of some collection stuff here. Let's just run this test and see what we get now. Now we get an error about there being no charges property. So let's add a constructor to our payment gateway here that initializes charges to be a new collection. And we can add that property up here. We'll just make a private charges property. Now if we run this test again, hopefully we get a different error. So now we're failing to assert that 0 matches the expected value of 2500. So let's head back to our test, and now we have to implement this charge method so that we actually track that charge. So if we look at the test, we're passing in an amount and then a token. So we'll have this take amount and then token. And for now, since we have nothing kind of telling us what should happen when the token is not valid, let's just always store this charge. So we can say this charges equals amount. And now if we run this test again, it's passing. So now, even though that we're obviously missing some stuff here around like failing if the token is invalid, I'm just going to leave it and jump back to our integration test and not worry about driving out any behavior that the fake payment gateway needs yet that hasn't been driven by our acceptance test. So let's run this again and just see what happens. So now we're getting an error that 0 does not match 9750, and that's happening down here. Now this is a little bit surprising because we actually haven't driven out this route or anything yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another assertion here to make sure that the request actually succeeded. So let's do something like this, assert response status, and maybe we'll do a 201, which is the HTTP response code for created. So let's run this test again and see what we get. So now we're getting an error about a 404 coming back instead of a 201, which makes a little bit more sense. But how can we see what the actual error was that caused this 404? Well, what's happening is Laravel is throwing an exception which is getting caught by the exception handler in app exceptions handler. And down here, it's converting exceptions into HTTP responses. So one trick that we can quickly use to see what the real error is to just rethrow this exception. So if we throw it again and run our tests again, we should see a more useful error. So now we see that there is no route defined and that we're getting a not found HTTP exception. So let's head back to our router and set up a new endpoint for this. So we can define a new route here. It'll be a post route to concerts/ID/orders. And now we have to decide where to point this. So when I'm working with nested resources like this, where there's orders inside of concerts, I like to give those their own dedicated controller. So I'm going to point this at concert orders controller. So a controller for the orders that belong to concerts. And we use the store method since we're creating a new order. If you go back and run our tests again, hopefully we get a new error. So now we get the error that there is no concert orders controller. So let's quickly scaffold that out on the command line. So we can run artisan make controller concert orders controller. And now if we run our tests again, let's see what error we get this time. So now we get an error that there is no store method. So let's head over to our HTTP controllers folder and open up the concert orders controller and add the store method. Now we can head back to our tests and run it one more time. And now we got a 200 back instead of a 201 because we're not actually doing anything. So let's edit our response here in our controller to return a 201 for now. So we can just do something like return response JSON. We'll just return an empty JSON response, that's a 201, and run the test again. And now we're back to failing to assert that 0 matches the expected 9750 value. So how can we go ahead and actually charge this customer for the tickets that they want to purchase? Well, we're going to need to use the charge method on our payment gateway, right? So somewhere in here, we're going to need to do something like payment gateway charge, and then the amount that we want to charge, as well as the token that we're using to do the charging. So where are we going to get this payment gateway from? Well, let's inject it through the constructor for now. So we'll have a payment gateway that comes in. And I think what we'll do is we'll type hint this with a payment gateway interface so that we can replace it with a different implementation in production than in our tests. So let's swap this out to this payment gateway charge, and let's just run this for now because we know this is going to break in some way, and just see what we got to do to kind of make the next step. So we're getting an error about there being no payment gateway class in the controller's namespace. Let's go into our billing namespace and create a new file called payment gateway. And we'll put this in the namespace app billing. We'll just make this an interface. In this interface, we'll at least have this charge method that takes an amount and a token. But that's probably it for now. The other stuff was kind of related to testing specifically. So if we go back to our actual fake payment gateway, we can make this implement the payment gateway interface. And now in our concert orders controller, we can import this from the billing namespace and run our tests again and see what happens. So now we're getting an error that the payment gateway interface is not instantiable. So what's happening is Laravel is trying to resolve it out of the container when it builds our controller, but it doesn't know what to give the controller. So we can fix this by specifying in our test what should be supplied when the container needs a payment gateway. So here, after we create the payment gateway, let's bind it to the container. We can say this app instance, and now we can say payment gateway class, which is our interface, so we'll make sure to import that. And we can say whenever the container needs an instance of the payment gateway interface, supply our fake payment gateway that we've instantiated here. So now if we run this test again, hopefully we get a new error. So now we're getting an error about an undefined variable amount. So we have to figure out where we're going to get this amount from. So let's head back to the controller and think about it a little bit. We have this ticket quantity coming in, and we have the concert ID in the URL parameters. So we can update this to maybe have the concert ID coming in. And we know that the ticket quantity is going to be equal to that parameter coming in from the request. So the amount is probably going to be equal to the ticket quantity multiplied by the ticket price of the concert, right? So let's get the concert. We'll say concert equals concert find concert ID. And we'll import that concert class so we have it available. And then amount is going to be ticket quantity multiplied by concert ticket price. And let's run this test again and see what happens. So now we're getting an error about an undefined variable token. Great. So let's head back to our controller and update that. So token can come from the request as well. So that'll just be request payment token. And now if we run our tests, what happens? So now we're getting an error about an undefined method orders, which means we're getting this far in our test. So this assertion has successfully passed. So in the next video, we'll walk through getting these assertions to pass and hopefully start on refactoring our controller a little bit.